So I'm joined by the Minister for Equality and Integration and Youth, and it's part of the Pride series of interviews that we're doing Dublin Pride 2024, and it's my pleasure to be joined by Roderic. Of course, he's one of our own, if you like. He's part of our community. First of all, happy Pride.
Thanks very much, Adam. Happy Pride to yourself as well. Looking forward now to the week ahead, to the parade on Saturday, and a couple of events between now and then.
Absolutely, it's a great time, isn't it, for the community and for our allies to come together. And it's a celebration, I suppose, in the first instance, and then it's some of the issues we'll discuss. We'll get into the kind of the more maybe meatier, kind of the more serious topics. I'm going to begin with the issue I think that you have very much kind of led with, I suppose, in terms of the LGBT kind of aspect of your brief, and that's around conversion, so-called conversion practices. Now, that's kind of been in gestation for quite a while with the Programme for Government Commitment and all that. Would you just give us an update, Roderic, on where that is at the moment with the legislation?
Well, absolutely. As you call, we've made a commitment to legislate against conversion practices on the basis of gender identity or on the basis of sexual orientation, and practices that are based on religious grounds or quasi-therapeutic grounds. Now, when you're trying to get a legal definition that addresses all of that, it's complicated. So our department has been back and forth with the Office of Attorney General, and that work is still ongoing. We want to make sure that we catch the types of practices that we've just discussed there. We also don't want it interfering with legitimate medical practices, legitimate therapy practices, nor do we want seeing it interfering with, I suppose, broader issues to do with freedom of religion as well. So we're looking to bring forward that definition. We would be looking, I suppose, now probably in the autumn term to bring forward the legislation, and we're just trying to tie down those final definitions at the moment.
Okay, so because I read, certainly say this legislative term, you were looking to have the heads of bill. So it has the heads of bill. Is that? I
think heads of bill probably in the autumn now at this stage. I'd hoped to have gotten it over the line in this term, but just as I say, with the need to get the definition right, because as you know, this will be challenged the whole way through as we go through the Oireachtas. So I want something that's robust, that we can stand over, and that we can get legislated.
And how confident are you that it will be delivered, I suppose, this side of government? I mean, obviously we don't know quite when there will be a general election, but certainly, from the autumn onwards, kind of that's into the early new year. So there probably would be a concern, perhaps, that when the government when an election is called, and I understand that's in the gift of the Taoiseach, that then all legislation falls. So
well, look, everyone, all three parties in government are looking to go the distance. And certainly even more recently, the Taoiseach has again spoken about bringing us all the way through into 2025. So I think within that timeline, there's definitely the room to get it through both houses of the Oireachtas. Obviously, if we had a very quick election after the summer recess, we wouldn't get through in this term of government. But I'll be doing everything I can to speed up that process to get that legislation through. And obviously, if a bill has gone through a couple of stages, there's always an option for the government that comes in next to actually revive it. Bills fall, but bills can be revived at whatever stage they're at, and they can be continued through. And I think across the political spectrum, there is broad agreement in terms of the need for this particular piece of legislation.
And of course, there has been research commissioned, the Trinity College research that your department commissioned back. It was published last year, and more recently we've seen in Northern Ireland the Rainbow Project and some other organisations there. Again, I suppose highlighting that this isn't a theoretical issue. It's thankfully not happening as much as maybe in the past, but it is happening.
And I know I've met people myself who've described their experiences, who've described the shame that they were made feel because they were LGBTI plus. And I think it's happening less now, but the fact that it happens at all, the fact that any young person is pressured by a family member or someone in their community to try and think away these thoughts or the like. It's not acceptable, it's a breach of that person's rights, and it shouldn't be legal, and that's what we're hoping to legislate for.
And that distinction, which we've all been very clear from the start, that it's not about interfering with people who are on, somebody talking, a parent, or somebody within a supportive setting. People explore their identity, who they are. I mean, we're very clear, aren't we? And other jurisdictions that have brought in this legislation, that it's where there's a predetermined outcome, where to change, to suppress, that somebody should not be gay, somebody should not be trans. That's what the legislation is capturing, isn't it?
And it's that high bar, and I think it's right, because it is an attempt to actually suppress another person's identity. And going into whether it's a quasi-therapeutic setting or a quasi-religious setting, with that as the outcome, the goal, to actually suppress, to actually interfere with someone's sexual orientation or their gender identity, and that's what we're looking to prohibit.
Would there be other jurisdictions, Roderic, that you would look to in terms of best practice, that you could kind of take as, that's an example of very good legislation, and if not quite copy and paste it here, but I suppose we're not reinventing the wheel either?
I don't think copy and paste is going to work in this context. I think, in terms of our criminal law and in terms of our constitutional setting, we're going to have to look at something quite unique to Ireland in terms of the design of the legislation and in terms of the definitions that we're looking at. That's certainly the legal advice that we've gotten so far. If it was kind of as simple as just taking, because I think they have legislation in New Zealand, they have legislation in Germany, but all of these legislative pieces are operating in different legal settings and different constitutional settings as well. So I think we are going to have to design something fairly bespoke for Ireland, and that unfortunately takes a little bit longer than we all might like.
And when you say bespoke, I mean in terms of kind of meeting what we kind of all kind of want, which is, and certainly in terms of the the ban, the NXF and others would be a member of the ban conversion practices platform, if you like. And I think there's three kind of core elements for us. And I think it would be useful for the listeners, the viewers, to be reassured. One is that, and you've been very clear about this in fairness, that it would be fully LGBT plus inclusive, so not leaving the trans community behind. The other one would be that there wouldn't be any kind of opt-outs on kind of religious grounds or on any other grounds, where that this practice would continue just under kind of in a different guise. And the third one would be, you've met, for example, Jane Ozanne, who's a survivor. She runs an organisation in the UK. If there's any kind of consent element to it, that would render the legislation meaningless, because people like Jane have said they on paper consented, but of course it was under duress, and it was on threat of being excommunicated from their religious communities. So for us, I suppose they're really key, to make sure that the legislation is operable. Yeah,
and look, all those different strands are so important, but they add to the complexity of the legislation as well, and ensure of absolutely, and you make that point about not being able to masquerade under another guise. As we know, in Ireland, we have religious protections in our constitution as well, and we just have to make sure that that isn't being used as a defence mechanism within anything that we legislate for. So all these issues are being teased out within our own department, and taking advice from the Office of the Attorney General as well. So we're looking forward to bring that legislation that meets I suppose the broad parameters that you set out there, that is constitutionally compliant, and that will actually be effective in terms of acting as a deterrent to anyone seeking to undertake these practices.
Has the legislation proven to be more challenging, I suppose, from the outset, let's say when it was in the programme for government, and you very much have been leading on the issue? Has the complexities of trying to make sure that, as you said, for constitutional reasons, has that been a more kind of lengthy process than you envisaged?
Well, it has been lengthy, yes, and as I said, I'd hope to have had heads published by the end of the summer term, and that's probably more likely to be into the autumn term now. So look, there's always complexity to legal issues, and as I said, having seen, I suppose, other jurisdictions move ahead, I suppose I thought perhaps they would provide a clearer pathway to the approach that we take here in Ireland. That hasn't proved to be doable in the Irish context. We're working on our own type of draft approach, and look, that just takes time to tease through those issues. And I think it's important we do that in the same way I wanted to undertake research at the start, because we know there will be attempts to undermine this, there will be attempts to kind of bring this into the wider culture wars issues that we see, play out far too often in politics, and particularly online. So I think it's really important that we've robust research behind it and robust legislation being brought through the houses, and that's what government are working to achieve.
Certainly, well, that update is definitely very useful, Roderic, because I think, and it's a segue into the next issue. There's so many issues in our community. There's legal issues. There's more broader kind of social issues that aren't kind of resolved by legal or by legislation. But in terms of the big ticket legislative items for this term of government, we've kind of been very clear from the outset that it's kind of hate crime and conversion practices. So we certainly, and there's a lot of noise, and you quite rightly referenced the culture war noise that are kind of targeting both bills. So definitely we'd be very keen as a community, I suppose, that at the end of whenever the election is, and that's not this isn't the gift of the Taoiseach, but that we're very much, I suppose, focusing kind of on those two kind of priority issues.
And of course big advances in terms of protection for LGBTI plus families, in terms of the assisted human reproduction legislation. I think we across government made a call to get that legislation over the line. There are amendments that have to be made to it. It has to be broadened out further as we go through these very complex issues around surrogacy, around assisted human reproduction, about the various family formations that exist here and the legal rights adhering to the various parties. There are complexities there as well, but I think we will see the core legislation setting out laws on assisted human reproduction and indeed surrogacy taking place abroad. That will be legislated, that will provide protection to a significant number of LGBTI plus families, and then there will be an amending piece of legislation to deal with new issues that have arisen as we've gone through this legislative process.
Because I know within that legislation that there's been particular challenges for, I suppose, the LGBT community, let's say gay men, for example. If, it's important that that the legislation is inclusive.
And I suppose, Minister Donnelly spoke quite eloquently about trying to get a large number of families recognised and protected, and then giving us the opportunity to bring in more, or do we delay and risk, I suppose, an election being called and nothing been legislated for, and the new government having to kind of come back and try and put the whole thing back together again. So look, I think it's really important. We have delayed this legislation to bring in the surrogacy piece. That's very important to a lot of Irish families, including many LGBTI plus families. Many parts of the assisted human reproduction element will protect LGBT plus families as well. But we are conscious that the legislation is going through, completed in the Dáil and now entering into the Seanad, doesn't include everybody yet, and that's why Minister Donnelly has been very clear in terms of making a commitment to bringing in amending legislation that will address those
It's certainly a very complex piece of legislation. There's no question about that. And much of it, you could say, stems from the 2014 Children and Family Relationships Act, and where I think that's testament to how complex, genuinely complex, the piece of legislation is. I know it doesn't come under your kind of ministerial brief per se, but I mean, as a member of the government, and certainly as a member of the LGBT plus community, hate crime, Roderic, is, I was saying in a different interview that there's almost an element of deja vu each year. We're talking about the hate crime legislation. It's been a priority since our Burning Issues report in 2016. More recently, we had an event, LGBT Ireland, the Get Out the Vote, before the local European elections. Really, I suppose, there's a source of kind of frustration at this point that we don't have the legislation in place, and how it's kind of fallen victim to, I suppose there are legitimate, issues to be teased out, but there's been a lot of noise around the bill, and that's of a concern. And there is great anxiety now in the community that the bill won't, in fact, be passed before in this term of government, and it would be a shame. But I also think it would be a big blow, and I think we shouldn't underestimate how much of a blow if we don't get this bill over the line.
Over 650 hate crimes reported to the Gardaí in 2023, and as we know, those are the reported ones, and there's plenty, probably hundreds more that went unreported. supported. And one of the things that's really disappointed me in the last number of months is that strong political consensus that had existed to get that legislation passed seems to have started to dissolve. One of the major opposition parties now saying they're not in favour of this particular legislation, which is really, really disappointing to see. But, you know, I've spoken to Minister McEntee, and I know she's absolutely committed to having hate crimes legislated against, and the bill has gone through, I think, committee stage. It's gone through first stage in the Seanad and it's going into committee stage now. Minister McEntee has kind of indicated her openness to bringing some amendments to maybe clarify some of the issues that have been raised in terms of the hate speech element, and I suppose just give clarification, give certainty to those who are worried that that's going to be used to kind of repress speech generally, which it's not, and there's actually a provision in the bill that states very clearly that that's not the case. But nevertheless, if more reassurance is needed and that can be given, I know Minister McEntee is looking to do that. But look, we've come a long way. We've got this bill through the Dáil. We're in the Seanad, and I think it's really important that we push on and make sure that hate crimes are made illegal under Irish law. Absolutely, because as you say, we don't have hate crime legislation in Ireland. We're a complete outlier in that respect, and whereas it's only part of the toolbox of measures, obviously, but I think it's the baseline. You need to have the legislation, you need to equip, I suppose, the criminal justice system and to give confidence to victims, because recognising something and having it kind of, there's an option in law at the moment where it can be the hate motivation, it can be kind of referenced, but it can be filtered out of the system. That's been the experience by the time it gets to court, by the time, you know, that works its way through. It's incredibly important for victims that it's acknowledged as such, because a hate crime is a crime of a different magnitude in terms of when you're targeted for who you are, and then the broader effect it has on the wider community who shares that person's characteristic. So we're kind of pushing all we can, and I suppose the frustration that's emerged within the community is that maybe the voices who are the most impacted by this have been a little bit drowned out. And we're obviously playing our part to try to kind of redress that, but the bill has fallen victim to this culture war narrative. It's fallen victim to disinformation. And as you rightly referenced, it passed overwhelmingly in the Dáil back in April 2023, 110 votes to 14. Between the Dáil and the Seanad, a lot of this kind of contrived kind of controversy took hold. And now it's been stalled in the Seanad for the past year, and it's not a theoretical issue, as you've said. I mean, I suppose we can't, you know, it's before the courts at the moment, but what happened in the Phoenix Park, you know, in the past few days, that's really rattled the community. Absolutely, the registered, you know, the year-on-year hate crimes are increasing, and we're kind of in this unusual situation where all this is happening, and yet the debate seems to be distracted by culture war. You know, and that's the community is concerned. It is a matter of huge concern and frustration that this delay has taken place. I think some of the discussion in the Seanad has been disappointingly uninformed, I think, on these issues. I think that point you made about the voices who are impacted by this maybe not being heard, and I know, for example, Senator Eileen Flynn has spoken very passionately about hate crimes taking place against members of the travelling community here in Ireland. So, you know, hate crimes are real. They, like, for me, this is a law and order issue, and it's been painted by a small number of members of the Oireachtas in both the Dáil and the Seanad as some sort of woke thing. It's not. It's about the safety of members of minority groups in our country to walk our streets and know that if someone singles them out for an act of violence, singles them out for persecution, that there is a legal consequence to them being singled out, and that the perpetrator will experience the consequences through the legal system. That doesn't exist right now, and it's really important that it does. That's a very good point, because you're right. Again, this term which I'm kind of loath to use, but this kind of wokeism and all that, it's a law and order issue. It's a victims' rights issue, as you say, because it's about being able to walk the streets and having the confidence that if you are the victim, that there is kind of that justice, you know what I mean, there is somebody can secure justice in those circumstances. So yeah, I mean, I was taken by some of the commentary, even in other government parties, I have to say. I mean, you referenced Sinn Féin, and that's certainly been addressed in another interview I've done with the Leader of the Opposition. But across the political spectrum, I think the way this debate has been framed has been very disappointing at times, when it's not this kind of abstract or theoretical issue. And I think where hate speech, because there's two aspects to the bill, as you know,
what people forget is that we already have hate speech legislation. It's not a new concept.
No.
So it's been made unusually kind of difficult, or the waters have been muddied, because we're updating legislation from 1989 when the internet, the online world didn't exist. And yes, so certainly we in the NXF and the broader Coalition Against Hate Crime want to be very clear, I suppose, that if this bill really is a priority for us, and to reinforce that message maybe with with yourself and with other with government more generally.
Yeah, and look, as I say, it remains a priority for me, and it's something I engage very closely with Minister McEntee on. Okay.
Moving on to another issue, I think, which is kind of, it's a little bit linked to what we've just talked about, and I think I'd be keen to get your insights into this. This kind of broader kind of hate and extremism, and kind of the far right kind of agitators. It's kind of in the online space, but it's increasingly kind of now becoming into kind of, real world consequences. We had the recent elections where candidates of all parties were being targeted and were being, particularly has to be said, women, members of minority communities, including our own. And I'm sure you'd agree with me that that's actually an attack on democracy itself, because if people feel this kind of contest of ideas, if people feel they can't go forward for election, that's not democracy then, as we know it. So, and I know as well, Roderic, you've had a direct experience of that kind of agitation. Like, how do we respond to that? Or how do we deal with it without, first of all, I suppose, exaggerating it, but not playing it down either? Because I think playing it down hasn't worked.
No, playing it down won't work. And look, I would have a real concern about the limitations on a number of candidates' ability to canvass in the recent local elections. There were candidates who were very clearly targeted for their gender, for their sexuality, particularly those members of minority communities, or those who'd stood up for minority communities, and targeted with intimidation and targeted with violence and destruction of posters and that. To an extent that there were candidates I know who were afraid to go out canvassing on their own, or afraid to canvass at all. And being in a small party, I was used to over the years always canvassing on my own, just building up the support as you go along. So the fact that people are worried, are genuinely concerned about engaging in the democratic process is a huge worry. And I think putting yourself forward to run, particularly in local elections, it's I wouldn't quite say selfless, but there's no great reward for being a county councillor. It's you're expected to do a lot of work, and you still probably have to have a day job on top of it as well. But it's really important work in terms of kind of being a voice and a link for your local community. And we should be encouraging people across all parties to make that important step. So I think the enhanced powers government have or the state has to regulate social media is important, because I think a huge part of this stems from that. I think the fact that where people are openly targeting others, particularly who are members of a minority community, the fact that we don't have a legislation, as we discussed earlier, to deal with that remains problematic and remains a gap in legal protections. And I think it is important that I suppose people who have a voice, who have a platform, are very clear on these issues and say that this sort of behaviour isn't acceptable. Because the more we see people protesting outside politicians' homes while their partner, their kids are inside, that is such a disincentive to anybody wanting to put themselves forward to engage in the political process.
And it's something that the vast majority of the public condemn outright. You see that there was an opinion poll, as if it needed to be shown, but just to be clear, most people regard that as wholly unacceptable. And then of course we've seen, there are legitimate discussions to be had around certain policy issues, of course, like immigration and how that is kind of teased out, and how we have integration and all that. That's public discourse, and that's only right.
Yeah.
I think when it tips over into intimidation, whether it's outside, people like asylum seeker accommodation, that people are living in those, as you're well aware, it's your brief. Libraries, something that the LGBT plus community have been targeted. That's not, and I was very taken by, I'm sure you heard the President's words on World Book Day, that this isn't protest, this is vigilantism. Yeah. And it has to be condemned. Now, do we need more legislative tools, do you think, Roderic? Is that an important part, that we have to beef up our legislation? I
also think it's important that we we have to get that balance between free speech and protest, and the right to protest and vigorously disagree with the policies of the government of the day, whereas at the same time not allowing a space for actions that are, as the President said, veering into the sphere of vigilantism. And I think a lot of that is about the public discourse. I think a lot of it is about, I suppose, the radicalisation that we're seeing that the online space allows people, and the fact that people have been kind of sucked down these rabbit holes, fed disinformation, fed, I suppose, affirming voices, affirming that disinformation. And I think that is probably, tackling that is probably the most important thing we can do, because that is the root cause, in my view, of that level of extremism we're seeing at the moment.
And it's where you have bad actors and, of course, kind of filling those spaces and kind of resisting regulation. And of course, your party colleague and your ministerial colleague, Catherine Martin, she would have kind of oversight, wouldn't she, of the and of course Ireland now has the when it comes to the Digital Services Act, we have European-wide responsibility.
Absolutely. And of course, Catherine passed the Online Safety and Media Regulation Act, and that set up the Online Safety Commission. We have our Safety Commissioner now in place. So Catherine's taken very significant steps to set up the infrastructure, and now it's important that the infrastructure that's been developed is deployed and used effectively to, I suppose, ensure that social media platforms are complying with the obligations set out in both domestic law and in EU legislation as well. And
would you be confident that enforcement, will follow as part when enforcement is necessary? Because we do hear kind of criticism or complaints that we're more broadly kind of we're poor on the enforcement side of things.
Well, I think a lot of this is very new, so I think we have to examine it closely in terms of making sure that it is effective. But I think a lot of it is going to be its first go in terms of seeing its effectiveness as an enforcement tool. So I think over the next year, I think we'll get a really good sense in terms of whether the legal provisions at Irish level or EU level are actually going to be able to impact. Are they going to make social media companies think again about their responsibilities, be more responsive to take down notices and the like?
Absolutely. So I suppose going to watch this space and kind of
very much so.
See how that develops. I suppose kind of one or two then kind of briefly, just kind of other issues. The Equality Review, the review into the Equality Acts. Could you give us an update on where that's at?
Yes, so again, we did a fairly significant public consultation on that piece, looking at updating the legislation and make it more usable as well. So again, I've seen draft heads of bill, and we'd again, hopefully probably again in the autumn term, looking to refer that to the Joint Oireachtas Committee for pre-legislative scrutiny.
And a part of that, would that be specifically, for example, I know indirectly under the gender ground, gender identity, for example, is recognised, but that would be part of the review, that gender identity would be more explicit, let's say, in the Equality Act? Well,
we're looking at a range of issues in the legislation. Some of them are dealing with, I suppose, equality matters that have been left behind in the past. So maternity leave for members of the Oireachtas, for example, looking at the Leave or Leave, so women who have cancer or serious illness while on maternity leave can actually get the benefit of their maternity leave. And we're also looking at other things in terms of the use of non-disclosure agreements in the context of sexual or kind of bullying misconduct when someone is leaving a workplace. So there's a range of issues that have been looked at there in the context of that review and in the context of the proposed legislation.
Okay, I mean, we could discuss so much more.
Indeed, yeah.
There's always, there's always more to discuss. But can I just say, or just ask you, Roderic, in terms of as a member of the LGBT plus community, this kind of pride, as we gather to celebrate, is there any particular message you'd have for the wider community that you'd like to share? Yeah,
well, I suppose we just have to always be really conscious of, where we've come, the steps we've made, particularly over the last 10, 15 years. The fact that for some in our community, particularly the most vulnerable, there have been greater pressures, and maybe some of them feel that they've seen actually some deterioration in their situation, particularly someone in the trans community who might have been subject to online abuse, particularly to a young gay woman who might have been attacked on our streets and heard racial slurs thrown at them. But I think we are pushing forward on all grounds, but we also always have to be conscious that, you know, there are those seeking to undermine and take away our rights, and we've seen in other European countries, and you look at Hungary and until recently Poland, that they'd seen a significant erosion of rights. So it's always important to remember what we've achieved, and we have to fight to hold on to those rights and develop them further.
That sense of complacency, because you look at, I mean, Hungary, obviously, Italy. Just finally, sorry, on the trans piece, obviously the trans community are feeling particularly under attack, and again, a lot of it is kind of being whipped up online. We have work to do, don't we, in that area? I mean, our Gender Recognition Act is, you know, quite progressive, but trans healthcare, we're ranked bottom of the list. That's something you've commented on before. I mean, would you be hopeful that we'll see movement there for trans healthcare, that we'll be in a better place?
Absolutely, and look, it's something I have discussed with Minister Donnelly and indeed Minister Butler, who's a strong advocate in this area as well, and it's something that we address consistently at the LGBTI plus steering committee for the national strategy. So look, we have a very considerable distance to go in terms of trans healthcare. I would hope that the changes we're seeing in the structures in the UK in terms of going to that more regionalised model in the UK, there is an ability for, I suppose, Ireland to work with the NHS in terms of one of the problems we've faced here is the lack of expertise, and that's a real problem for us in terms of these are quite specific knowledge base that is needed to particularly lead a trans healthcare service for adults, or indeed for those under 18. So I'm hoping that we can, you know, tune into some of the work that's done in the NHS, some of the expertise that exists there, and use that to maybe help develop our own services here.
And I suppose within that as well, that because there would be concerns when I talk about that kind of toxic discourse, a lot of it actually would be Britain has been a magnet for that. Now, obviously the NHS, the medical model and all that is different, but I suppose maybe some people hearing that might have concerns that we'd be outsourcing kind of the issue to Britain, where there's been a very hostile
It's certainly not a case of outsourcing, but it's a case of recognising the, I suppose, the lack of real expertise in this area that exists in Ireland right now, and seeing are there innovative ways that we could look to work with experts within the British system to provide the supervision, to provide the kind of clinical governance, the clinical oversight that is so important in terms of developing trans healthcare systems that works for those seeking that really important healthcare.
Okay, well, Minister Roderic O'Gorman, I want to thank you for your time. I want to wish you happy Pride. You're not just a government minister, as I said at the start, you're also a member of our community, a proud and long-standing. You know, you've done a number of these interviews.
Indeed, yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Adam. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Thank you.